On the morning of March 25th, 2009, 41-year-old Kay Parsons woke up in her bedroom in the quiet suburb of Grovetown, Georgia. It was still dark outside, but Kay knew she had a busy morning ahead of her. So she got right out of bed and walked down the hallway to wake up her son. When she went into his room, her son, who was 12 years old, immediately began complaining that he didn't want to wake up yet, but Kay just flipped on his lights and said, "Come on, you gotta get ready for school." Once Kay saw her son actually climb out of bed and begin to get dressed, she rushed downstairs and poured him a bowl of cereal and left it on the table, and then called up to him and said, "Come on, come down, eat your breakfast." And then Kay rushed right back upstairs into her bedroom to get dressed. Now, normally, Kay had help with the morning routine from her husband, David. But David was in Los Angeles on business. David was a career military man who had become a successful civilian contractor after retirement, which meant David worked for the military, but he was not actually a member of the military. And generally speaking, civilian contractors with the military make a lot of money. David's work at a nearby army base is what had brought the family to Georgia 4 years earlier, and his job had allowed them to buy their beautiful 2-story, 4-bedroom home. But the trade-off with David's financial success was that he often had to travel for work, leaving Kay to manage on her own. Most of the time, Kay was perfectly happy to take on everything at home by herself because she knew David was doing his part for the family in other ways. Kay and David had been together since they were in high school, and people who knew them said they had the kind of partnership that made other couples jealous. They seemed to function as this perfect unit, and they always knew how to help the other. But the truth was, behind the scenes, Kay and David were not perfect, and lately they had been going through a really rough patch. They'd been getting in these horrible fights, and then after the fights would end, they would just ignore each other for long periods of time. And so as Kay rushed around her bedroom getting dressed for the day, she couldn't help but feel kind of resentful towards David for not being here that morning to help her. But Kay quickly told herself she was being foolish. Even though they were fighting, she knew the reason David was gone was for work. He was there to help the family, and so she couldn't really be resentful about it. Once Kay was finished getting dressed, she ran to her son's bedroom and grabbed his backpack, and then went back downstairs to the kitchen. When she got there, her son said he was done eating, so Kay handed him his backpack, then she grabbed his empty cereal bowl and put it in the sink, and then she picked up her white leather handbag off the counter and took out her car keys. Then Kay stopped herself because she knew she was running around like a maniac, and she took a breath and then looked over at her son and smiled. Even when she and David were not getting along, they still made sure their son always felt like their house was filled with love and happiness. Kay's son smiled back at her, and then the two of them walked to the garage and got into Kay's car. Kay pulled out of the garage onto Hot Springs Drive, her quiet neighborhood street. And as she did, she looked over at the house next door, another beautiful brick home strikingly similar to her own. And in many ways, Kay and her family's lives in Grovetown were directly connected with that house next door. On the day that Kay, David, and their son had moved in, their next-door neighbors, Becky and Tony Sears, and their 5 kids, had dropped by with food to welcome them to their new home. From then on, the two households became inseparable. The adults played tennis together, one of the Sears boys was on the same baseball team as Kay's son, and the two families had vacationed together. Becky even got Kay a job at Healing Hands, the physical therapy clinic where she worked. And not long after Kay and Becky had begun working together, they joined Weight Watchers together. And Kay gave Becky a lot of credit for helping her meet her weight loss goals. Every day, Becky wanted to compare weights and discuss who had lost the most. It made Kay anxious, but she had to admit, peer pressure worked. But in recent weeks, Kay had been so caught up in the problems she was having with her husband that she really hadn't even spoken to Becky. And as Kay drove past Becky's house that morning, she wished she could go back in time to when everything had seemed so perfect. After Kay dropped her son off at school, she went to a McDonald's drive-thru. Even though Kay was a part of Weight Watchers and was trying to lose weight, when she was really stressed out or rushed, she often treated herself to fast food. Kay quickly ate her McDonald's breakfast in the car as she drove back home. She was in a hurry because her handyman, Mitch Cozart, would be arriving at her house soon. Mitch was coming by to repair the back door. But as Kay drove, she was thinking about other projects she might ask him to take care of while he was already at the house. And Kay was still lost in her own thoughts about what she was going to ask him to do when she pulled back into her 2-car garage at around 7:15 a.m. Kay got out of her car and walked into the house carrying a half-finished cup of McDonald's coffee and an empty fast food bag. and within seconds of stepping foot inside of her house, Kay heard a loud crashing sound in the kitchen. It sounded like something breaking. Kay had no idea how anything could be falling in her kitchen, and so she quickly rushed around the corner to see what was going on. But what she saw in the kitchen was the last thing she expected. At 8:30 a.m., Kay's handyman, Mitch, walked onto Kay's front porch and rang the doorbell. He knew Kay was expecting him, so he was surprised when no one answered the door. After a few moments, Mitch pulled out his flip phone and called Kay, but Kay didn't pick up. Mitch peeked in the windows of the home, but he couldn't see anyone inside the house, so he walked around to the back. He was there to fix the elegant French doors that were in the back of the house, and so he figured he could at least take a look at the job while he was waiting for Kay. But when Mitch came around the corner of the house and actually saw these French doors, he froze, because one of the panes of glass in the French doors was completely shattered and the French door was open. He called out for Kay from the outside, but no one answered. Mitch had seen enough cop shows to know that he did not want to go inside this house himself and potentially leave fingerprints or footprints, and so instead, Mitch grabbed his phone again and he called 911 to report what appeared to be a break-in. But as Mitch was talking to the 911 operator, he noticed this young man with black hair sitting on the other side of the road on this rock, just staring at Mitch. And then as soon as Mitch got off the phone, the young man with black hair called out to him. Mitch walked across the street towards him, and as he did, he could see the young man looked pretty shaken up. When Mitch finally reached the young man, he told Mitch his name was Michael Bowers, and he lived next door to Kay, and he was actually Kay's friend Becky's oldest son, who was from a previous marriage. Mitch asked Michael if he was okay, but Michael said no. He said he'd overheard Mitch's phone calls to 911, so he knew that Kay's house had been broken into, and he told Mitch that his own house had been broken into as well. He said the house was ransacked with drawers emptied onto the floor and the whole place was a mess. Michael said he had just called his mother at work to let her know. At this point, Mitch was very worried, and he told Michael to stay right where he was and to not go back inside of his house because whoever had broken in might still be there. Then Mitch went back across the street to his truck and he pulled out the gun he kept in the glove compartment just in case. Then he went back across the street and waited with Michael for the police to arrive. A few minutes later, Sergeant Jimmy Edmunds of the Columbia County Sheriff's Office arrived at Kay's house. His office had received 2 calls within minutes of each other to report break-ins in neighboring houses on Hot Springs Drive. Edmunds thought just 1 break-in would be very unusual for such a quiet, low-crime neighborhood, but 2 break-ins? Something strange was going on. Sheriff's deputies arrived on the scene soon after, and at that point, Edmunds walked around the house with them to the back door with the shattered glass. But before Edmunds even went inside the house, he saw an ominous sign. He could clearly see blood on the kitchen floor. Edmunds turned back around and looked at the deputies and made sure they saw the blood too, and they nodded, and then Edmunds led them into the house. And immediately Edmunds saw the blood trail went all the way out of the kitchen and down the front hall. And the blood was not just on the floor. There was also blood spattered all over the walls too. As Edmunds followed this grotesque blood trail all through the house, he passed by a spilled McDonald's coffee and a crumpled McDonald's bag and a white handbag on the floor. Then he saw a bloody handprint on the wall right beside the door to the garage, and he opened up the door. And there, lying beside her car in a big pool of blood, was Kay Parsons. Edmunds quickly rushed over and crouched down beside Kay and placed his fingers on the inside of her wrist, and amazingly, he found a pulse. Kay was alive, so Edmunds shouted for one of the deputies to call an ambulance. As Edmunds stayed crouched down with Kay, telling her over and over again that help was on the way, Edmunds just could not believe the amount of blood he was seeing, not just all over the house, but on Kay, on her face, her arms, her clothes. He had been investigating violent crime for years, but he'd never seen someone beaten as badly as Kay Parsons was. There was a bloody aluminum baseball bat lying beside Kay, and Edmunds was reasonably sure it had been used to bludgeon her. And then Edmunds also noticed there was a second weapon underneath the car, a bloody claw hammer. Seconds later, the ambulance finally arrived and Kay was rushed to the hospital. And as soon as she was gone, Edmunds led a room-by-room search of her house. And at first glance, it looked to Edmunds like Kay must have come home and interrupted a robbery in progress. The house was a complete mess upstairs and downstairs, as though someone had run through the entire house, searching every single drawer as quickly as possible. But the sheer brutality of the attack on Kay made Edmunds think this could be something else. I mean, what kind of burglar would suddenly begin bludgeoning someone to death with a hammer and bat just because they interrupted them? And so this just felt like a deeply personal crime to Edmunds, not just some random robbery. At some point during the room-by-room search, Edmunds stepped away and performed the grim duty of calling Kay's husband, David, to tell him what happened. Now, Edmunds didn't really go into any details over the phone. He just told David that he would need to fly home from Los Angeles immediately. David could tell, obviously, something terrible had happened, and by the time he hung up, David was reasonably sure that his wife had been badly injured. So he booked the first flight back to Georgia and rushed to the airport. Back at Kay's house, Edmunds knew he still had a second break-in to investigate, and he was afraid he would find another victim of a vicious attack. So Edmunds rounded up a few other deputies and walked next door to the Sears' home. The back door had been broken open, just like over at Kay's house, and the contents of drawers in the Sears' home had been dumped all over the place, just like in Kay's house. There were also smears of blood here and there, but not nearly as much as next door. The deputies combed the house from top to bottom, and luckily, they did not find another victim. Edmunds was searching the ransacked kitchen for potential evidence when Becky Sears, the mother, and her 19-year-old son, Chris, came into the backyard. Becky told Edmunds they had both been at work when her other son, Michael, had called to tell her about the break-in, so they'd rushed home as fast as they could. But Becky did not care at all about the fact that her house had been trashed and ransacked, because moments before Becky had walked into her house, a neighbor had told her that her good friend, Kay, had been taken away in an ambulance, and so all Becky wanted to know now from Edmunds was if Kay was okay. Edmunds was not really able to share any details about Kay, other than the fact that she had been alive when she was taken to the hospital. Within minutes, another neighbor appeared at the Sears' house and offered to give Becky and Chris a ride to the hospital to go check on Kay. And so Becky and Chris, they rushed out the door with that neighbor as fast as they had shown up, and Edmunds was suddenly left alone in the quiet kitchen, thinking about all these terrible things that had just unfolded in this small, seemingly safe suburban neighborhood. Edmunds figured Kay's house must have come first, and the person who broke in killed Kay, and then they must have come over to Becky's house next, but still had Kay's blood on their hands. And so that was why there was blood in both houses, despite there only being a victim in Kay's house. But that didn't make Edmunds feel much better. He now knew he was dealing with a criminal who was cool enough and cruel enough to beat this helpless woman until they were totally covered in her blood, and then casually just go next door, again covered in their blood, to rob another house. Edmunds wondered what kind of person could do something like that. Becky and some of Kay's other friends stood vigil in Kay's hospital waiting room all day long. They were desperate to get any word on Kay's condition. Every so often, Becky would ask one of the nurses if she could go in to see her friend, but they always said no, because the medical team was still trying to stabilize Kay. Eventually, another friend did make it to Kay's actual bedside, and she didn't even recognize the heavily bandaged person lying there. Kay's face was grotesquely swollen, and she was attached to all kinds of tubes and wires that were keeping her alive. The nurse wouldn't answer when the friend asked if Kay was brain dead. Finally, late in the afternoon, Kay's husband, David, arrived at the hospital straight from the airport. Sergeant Edmunds and other officers escorted David past Kay's friends to Kay's room, and they let him go in there all by himself. Seconds later, from beyond the double doors, Kay's friends heard David begin to sob. Kay had just died. Some of Kay's friends began to weep when they heard David crying, but Sergeant Edmunds had a different reaction to David. He wondered if David's loud display of grief was just a bit too much. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but Edmunds got the sense that David was just performing for an audience. While Edmunds was at the hospital, members of his investigative team had gone door to door all throughout Kay's neighborhood to try to get more information about what happened. But unfortunately, so far, they'd come up with nothing. Nobody in the neighborhood had heard or seen anything unusual between 7 and 8:30 a.m. that morning. So after Edmunds got back to the sheriff's department, he decided he would just bring in all of the people who had been at the crime scene one by one. And he started with Kay's handyman, Mitch. Once Mitch arrived at the station, Edmunds and Mitch would sit down across from each other in a small interview room. And Edmunds watched Mitch right away fight back tears as he recounted showing up at Kay's house and finding the smashed glass in the back door. Edmunds was initially skeptical of Mitch's story. After all, this guy had just happened to show up at the house right after Kay had been attacked. But Mitch would show Edmunds some emails that made it clear Kay really had been expecting him at her house at 8:30 a.m. that morning. And when Edmunds had searched Kay's house earlier, he hadn't seen any sign that Mitch ever went inside. So for the time, Edmunds decided Mitch was not a major suspect. But just when Edmunds was starting to think Mitch would have nothing useful to offer, Mitch began talking about the young man with black hair who was sitting on the other side of the street who had overheard his 911 call. The young man had told Mitch that his name was Michael and that he was Becky's oldest son. The mention of Michael made Edmunds' mind start racing. He had learned through his initial investigation that Becky's oldest son had a history of drug problems. The 22-year-old had once been a heroin addict. And Edmunds wanted to know why Michael was sitting across the street from Kay's house, which was now a murder scene, instead of in front of his own house, which had just been looted. Because remember, Michael didn't know what was going on in Kay's house until he overheard Mitch talk about Kay's house being robbed. And so Edmunds couldn't help but wonder if maybe Michael had tried to rob Kay's house to pay for his drug habit, but then Kay surprised him by coming home. She would have known Michael's face very well, and so maybe he decided to kill her so she wouldn't be able to identify him. Edmunds thanked Mitch for his help and ultimately let him go. Then he summoned Michael to the station. When Michael arrived, Edmunds led him into the small interrogation room, and the two sat down on opposite sides of a table. Michael was quiet and very polite, and as he sat there, he absently ran his hands through his dark black hair. Edmunds was very blunt, and he asked Michael if he was still using drugs. Michael admitted that he was. He said he was still fighting his heroin addiction, and in fact, that day, he had used methadone to try to curb his heroin cravings. Methadone is a medication that's often used to help people reduce or stop their use of heroin or other opiates. And so because Edmunds had wondered if Michael went to Kay's house to rob her to pay for drugs, Edmunds began to zero in on where Michael had been before the handyman Mitch had discovered the break-in at Kay's house. Michael stayed calm and polite. He claimed that his mother had dropped him off at 7 a.m. for a house painting job. But when Edmunds pressed Michael for details about this job, Michael's story fell apart. He couldn't say who he was working for or even where the job was. Now, Michael was starting to shift around in his seat uncomfortably. So Edmunds asked him again where he had been when Kay was attacked. Michael admitted he had been lying about the house painting job, but only because he didn't want his mother to know he was unemployed. He said he had really been watching TV at a friend's house. Edmunds was very annoyed that Michael had just lied to him, so he got up and walked out of the room. And Edmunds would keep Michael in that interrogation room for 3 more hours while he decided what to do with him. And in the end, Edmunds and his team, despite their suspicions, knew they really had no evidence linking Michael directly to this crime, so they couldn't just hold him indefinitely. But just before Edmunds was about to turn Michael loose, on a hunch, he asked Michael if he could look at the bottom of his sneakers. And when Michael showed him, Edmunds saw that wedged into one of the treads of one of his shoes was a gleaming shard of glass. When Edmunds asked Michael where the glass came from, Michael had no explanation. And so, as Michael walked out the door of the sheriff's office, he didn't know it, but he had just become Sergeant Edmunds' primary suspect. Not long after Michael left the sheriff's office, his 19-year-old brother, Chris, arrived for his interview. Chris was everything that Michael was not. He had a job, he had his own house, he had respectable friends, and he was so nervous when he sat down for his interview that Edmunds had to keep reassuring him that he was not actually in trouble yet. Chris said that he had gotten up that morning at about 7 a.m. He'd barely had enough time to brush his teeth before his mother, Becky, pulled up to his house. He had agreed to go work with Becky that day at the physical therapy clinic where she was the office manager. Chris was going to help out with several odd jobs around the building, but when his brother Michael had called about the break-in, Chris and his mom had left the clinic right away. Then, Edmunds got Chris talking about his brother Michael, and the conversation soon turned to Michael's drug habit. Chris confirmed that his brother was taking methadone again and struggling with his heroin addiction, and he was hanging with a very bad crowd. At this, Edmunds immediately grabbed a sheet of paper and a pen, and he asked Chris to tell him the names of the people Michael was spending his time with, who in theory might commit the kind of violent crime he was investigating. Chris looked at him and he said, "You might need a larger piece of paper." By midday on March 26th, so 24 hours after Kay had been discovered, Sergeant Edmunds was totally exhausted because basically he hadn't slept for the last 24 hours. But he knew he had a killer loose in his town, so he had no choice but to press on. And the more he found out, the more he suspected Kay's neighbor, Michael. First, Edmunds talked to the friend who Michael said he was with at the time of the murder. In a recorded conversation at the sheriff's office, Michael's friend emphatically said that he and Michael really had been watching TV together when Kay was attacked. But the friend offered to take a polygraph test right then and there, and he failed. Then, later in the afternoon, Edmunds called the owner of the physical therapy clinic where Kay's friend Becky worked, and the owner told Edmunds that Becky's son, Michael, had once stolen a company checkbook and written about $800 in bad checks before he was caught. The owner said he had agreed not to call the police after Becky had promised him that her son Michael would never step foot in the clinic again. But Edmunds still wondered whether the seemingly very laid-back and low-key Michael really had it in him to commit such a totally violent crime on this woman who seemed totally defenseless. But the evidence really was increasingly against Michael. The murder was looking more and more like a robbery gone wrong, either committed by Michael or one of his friends, and very likely just to get money for drugs. That evening, Michael and Chris's mother, Becky, was leaving work at the physical therapy clinic, and as she was walking down a dark walkway towards the parking lot, she thought she heard something in the bushes behind her. Becky turned around to see what the noise was, and she was totally startled to see a man wearing black clothes with a white baseball cap standing there in the bushes. Becky froze, and the man just started shouting at her that he wanted his money. Becky said she had no idea what he was talking about, but the man clearly was not playing around because he raised a gun and started waving it right in Becky's face. But Becky really didn't know anything about any money and so kept saying, I don't know. Finally, the man seemed to have enough and he lowered the gun from Becky's face to her left leg and he fired it right into her left shin. The bullet glanced off the bone and grazed Becky's right ankle. She felt a sharp pain rushing through both her legs and she collapsed to the ground. As Becky lay there stunned and bleeding, staring up, waiting to get shot again, the man actually lowered the gun and said next time he was going to shoot her right in the face. Then the man just turned and ran off into the darkness. Becky, who was totally in shock and had no idea what was going on, still managed to grab her phone in her pocket and she called 911. After an ambulance arrived and took Becky to the hospital, sheriff's deputies searched the nearby woods for the shooter. They didn't find him, but all of them assumed one thing. This attack was not random. This shooting had to be connected to the break-ins on Hot Springs Drive and to Kay's murder. Becky was resting comfortably in her hospital bed when Sergeant Edmunds arrived to speak with her. Becky seemed perfectly fine to talk about what happened, and she would give Sergeant Edmunds a very detailed account of her attack. But when Edmunds asked her if there was any way her son Michael could have had something to do with this shooting, she was very quick to reject it. Edmunds speculated to Becky that perhaps her son Michael owed the shooter drug money, so the shooter was taking it out on Michael's mother. But Becky would respond by saying no, her son used to owe people money, but he didn't anymore. He didn't have debts anywhere. Edmunds could see this line of questioning was likely going nowhere, because Becky, despite her situation, seemed to be very set on protecting her kids, which makes sense, even if her son was guilty, she's going to protect him. So Edmunds decided to try a new tactic. He asked Becky if she had any relationship troubles. Was there anyone in her personal circle who might want to hurt her? Becky didn't answer. She turned away from Edmunds and just kind of stared off into the distance. Then, without looking at him, she told him that she had a terrible secret that she had to get off her chest. Then, Becky told Edmunds she had cheated on her husband. She said her husband was a truck driver, which meant he was away a lot, and during his absences, she had turned to another man for comfort. But she insisted the affair was over and that she and her husband were working out their issues now. Edmunds had a lot more questions, but right at that moment, nurses began coming in and out of Becky's room to check on her. So for the time being, Edmunds just kind of let the topic slide without even finding out who this other man was who Becky had been romantically involved with. The next morning, March 27th, Edmunds was hoping that his third cup of coffee might finally wake him up. His investigation was only a few days in, but Edmunds had been going nonstop. Just then, Sergeant Edmunds' phone rang, and so he picked it up, and before he could even call out a greeting, the person who was calling him said they had information about Kay's murder that he needed to hear. Edmunds asked who the caller was, but they would only say they were close to Becky and her family. Then the caller said they knew who Becky was having an affair with. It was Kay's husband, David. The caller said the neighbors, Becky and David, had been having the affair for 6 months before the murder, writing love letters back and forth and hooking up all over town. Becky wanted both of them to leave their spouses so they could be together, but David was worried that he would lose custody of his son if he split from his wife. After the anonymous caller hung up, Edmunds desperately wanted to talk to Kay's husband, David, but he knew he would have to wait until after Kay's funeral, which was that afternoon. At Kay's funeral, David was surrounded by loving supporters who had no idea that he had been cheating on his murdered wife. But one of Kay's closest friends couldn't shake the feeling that David was acting strangely for a man at his wife's funeral. When she had given David a hug, he told her that he was sorry and that he never wanted this to happen. The friend didn't understand what that meant, but she didn't think it was the right time to ask. At the end of the service, David, Becky, and all of Kay's loved ones looked on with sorrowful expressions as 6 pallbearers carried Kay's casket out of the church. Then the pallbearers put the casket into a hearse for the trip to the cemetery. David walked with his son to a waiting car that would follow the hearse, but Sergeant Edmunds approached and stopped them. Edmunds took David by the arm and quietly told him that they needed to talk right away. He said he understood that the family was obviously grieving, but really this couldn't wait. Edmunds asked David to come to the station right after Kay was interred. That evening, David looked emotionally raw and weary when he sat down across from Edmunds in the small interrogation room at the sheriff's station. Edmunds then told David point blank that he was in serious trouble and that he would not be doing his son or his family any good if he lied right now to the police and ended up going to jail. David seemed to know what this was about, and he nodded in agreement. Then Edmunds asked him about the affair with Becky, and David definitely saw this coming because right away he just began confessing. David said his affair with Becky had started about 6 months earlier when she had flirted with him on the tennis court. They had been playing doubles against Becky's husband and Kay when Becky had made a bad shot. She had leaned in close and said to David that she was playing badly because he was distracting her. Not long after that, the two began meeting at his house, her mother's house, or in their cars like it was some kind of high school romance. David said that he and Becky had pledged their love for each other, but he was just not ready to upset his own marriage. He worried that if he got divorced, Kay would take their son far away from him and prevent him from seeing him. So David and Becky's affair remained secret. But then David said he had broken things off with Becky a month before Kay's murder. David had told Becky they couldn't be together, at least until his 12-year-old son had graduated from college. David said that Becky was devastated, but she had accepted his decision and decided instead to focus on her own relationship with her husband. And Becky really had begun working on that relationship with a bracing dose of honesty. She admitted to her husband that she had been having an affair with their neighbor, David, and her husband did not take it well. He was shocked and furious, and he immediately called Kay to ask if she knew that her husband, David, was having an affair with his wife, Becky. Kay was totally caught off guard and said she absolutely did not know that. After that, David had had no choice but to confess to Kay about the affair and then beg for Kay's forgiveness. And to his surprise, Kay had accepted his apology and said they would work through their crisis together. But Kay had said she would not have her family living next door to Becky any longer. She wanted to sell the house immediately. Kay had also quit her job where she and Becky worked together, and she vowed never to speak to her former friend again. David said he was done speaking to Becky too, and that he was ready to make a fresh start. When David finished talking, Edmunds just stared at him for a second and then looked down at his notes. Edmunds had all of David's cell phone records, and he knew that David had continued talking to Becky after their supposed breakup, including a call that lasted nearly 2 hours on the night before Kay's murder. And when Edmunds brought this up to David, that clearly David had just lied to him about his real relationship with Becky, David's face turned beet red, but he pressed ahead again. He admitted he had spoken to Becky numerous times after the breakup, but it was just to see how she was holding up. But on the night before Kay's murder, when David was in Los Angeles on business, he admitted that long conversation he had had with Becky had turned sexual. And on that call, they had both admitted that they still had strong feelings for each other. Edmunds said that could explain the call David made the night before the murder, but David had also called Becky right around the time Kay was bludgeoned to death, so Edmunds wanted to know what that call was about. David said he had only talked to Becky on the morning of the murder because at the time he'd been worried about his wife. Kay hadn't picked up when he had called her, so kind of out of desperation, he had just called Becky to see if maybe she had heard anything about Kay. Edmunds didn't say anything back to David, but inside, he wondered if the real reason David had called right at that time was to find out if his wife had been murdered yet. David seemed to know exactly what Sergeant Edmunds was thinking, so David quickly denied having anything to do with Kay's death. He said the last thing he would ever want to do was take his son's mother away from him. Before David could say anything else, Edmunds cut him off and said, desperate people do desperate things. At this, David just kind of hunched over and fell silent. It was now dark outside, and the interview had gone on for 3.5 hours. Edmunds stood up, stretched, excused himself, and walked out of the room. Then, once he was outside the room, he watched from the other side of the one-way glass as David started to cry. And as he cried, all they could hear David saying to himself was, "Everyone is going to blame me." Edmunds knew David had been in Los Angeles at the time of Kay's murder. But after this meeting with David, he thought David could have been involved in some way. After all, David's wife was murdered, and the woman he'd been having an affair with was in the hospital from a gunshot wound. Later that evening, Edmunds was at his desk when he received a very strange call from an inmate at the county jail. The inmate said he knew who killed Kay Parsons. Edmunds asked why he should trust a guy who was in jail at the time when Kay had died, so how could he possibly know the truth? And the inmate just said Edmunds really needed to trust him because before he ended up in jail, Kay's killer had asked him to help with this murder. Edmunds was reasonably convinced that this guy had real information, but the inmate made it clear to Edmunds that he wanted to give him the information in person. So Edmunds hung up and he immediately headed to the jail. And Edmunds was waiting inside of an interview room when guards escorted in a middle-aged man dressed in pink jail sweats and flip-flops. The inmate did not hold anything back when he spoke to Edmunds, and by the time Edmunds left the county jail, he had multiple new leads to follow up on. And within days, those leads would pay off, and the police would finally figure out who had killed Kay. Based on information provided by that inmate, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Kay Parsons on the morning of March 25th, 2009. At around 7:15 a.m., the killer saw Kay's car driving down the street towards her house. So the killer quickly darted around to the back of Kay's house to those French doors. The killer had a claw hammer in their hand, and so after looking around to make sure nobody could see them, they raised that hammer and then smashed in one of the glass panes on the French doors. Then the killer reached in through the opening, unlocked the door, and stepped inside of Kay's kitchen. Now, at the same time this was happening, Kay actually was entering the home through the front door. And so the killer figured Kay must have heard the glass shattering. So the killer just kind of clutched their hammer tight and waited to see what Kay would do. A few seconds later, Kay walked into the kitchen to see what was going on, and she saw a person standing there carrying a hammer, and so naturally she began to scream. Before Kay could turn and run though, the killer leapt at her and swung the hammer wildly. Kay immediately threw her arms up to protect her head and her face, but the killer just kept beating her arms with the hammer over and over again until she lowered them, at which point the killer began smashing Kay in the head and the torso, and blood began spraying everywhere. Kay stumbled backwards out of the kitchen, barely conscious, but somehow she managed to turn and actually run away from her killer. The killer was totally shocked that at this point Kay was still on her feet, and so for a second, the killer just stood there watching as Kay kind of stumbled down the hallway. But when Kay actually reached the door that led into the garage, the killer kind of realized what they needed to do, and they chased after Kay. And so Kay, she gets that door open, and she manages to walk into the garage, but by this point, she had lost so much blood, she was so badly beaten that she just fell to the ground right by her parked car. The killer rushed into the garage after her, and then stood over Kay and raised the hammer, but the hammer was so slick from all the blood on it that when they tried to bring it down, it slipped out of their hand and slid under Kay's car. In a panic, the killer looked around the garage for another weapon to finish Kay off, and their eyes fell on the aluminum bat propped up against the wall. The killer lunged for the bat and then came back over to Kay, and they stood there bludgeoning her over and over and over again until she wasn't moving. The killer, the garage, and Kay were now all covered in blood, and the killer was reasonably sure that at this point Kay was dead. They had no idea she actually still had a pulse. The killer dropped the bat and ran back into the house. They trashed every room inside, throwing things on the ground and doing whatever they could to make it look like this was a robbery. Then, feeling satisfied, the killer crept out through the open French door, stepping on broken glass as they left. Once they were outside, the killer glanced back and forth to make sure nobody had seen them. Then they ran right next door into Becky's house and ransacked that place too. But then, after they were done, instead of leaving, the killer stripped off their bloody clothes and found a fresh set of clothes in that house to change into, and then they grabbed their phone and called their mother. It would turn out Becky's heroin addict son, Michael, who everybody assumed was involved in some way with this murder, had nothing to do with it. Becky's other son, Chris, the so-called good son, he had been the one who murdered Kay. Chris had always been Becky's favorite child, and he would do anything to make his mom happy. Becky had told Chris things about her life that she would never tell her other son, Michael. So Chris was aware of the fact that his mom was having an affair with their neighbor, David, and that she believed David was actually still in love with her. And so Chris also came to believe that his neighbor, Kay, was actually standing in the way of his mother's happiness. In fact, Becky had even said to Chris that she wanted Kay dead. And all of this information began to come to light when Sergeant Edmunds met with the inmate who had called him. It turned out the inmate was Becky's own brother, and he told Sergeant Edmunds that Becky had asked him if he knew anyone who could kill Kay and make it look like an accident. At first, he had thought she was joking, but after Becky kept pressing him, he knew she was serious. So when he learned that Kay really had been killed, he was sure his sister had something to do with it. And so that's why he reached out to Sergeant Edmunds. Now, after hearing this from the inmate, Edmunds still believed that Michael had to be involved, that maybe Becky had asked him to carry out the murder. But when Edmunds questioned Michael again, it was clear the young man had no idea about his mother's affair. So Edmunds went back to the hospital to meet with Becky, who was still recovering from her gunshot wounds. Edmunds interrogated Becky, and she finally cracked. She admitted that she had told her other son Chris all about the affair and about how much she hated Kay, but Becky didn't stop there. She told Edmunds that she had asked Chris to confront Kay on her behalf on the morning of the murder, but she said she didn't think her son would do anything violent. But after Chris had just killed Kay and then came back to his own house and staged another break-in and changed out of his bloody clothes, he had called his mother and told her he had just murdered Kay. She had driven to the house, picked Chris up, and gone with him to dispose of his bloody clothes, and then when they came back to the house, because her other son Michael had called her saying, "Oh my goodness, our house has been broken into," when she and Chris came back, all the police were there, and she would tell the police right away that she and Chris had been working at the clinic all that morning. And then after that, Becky and Chris had staged the shooting outside of Becky's work. Chris was the shooter who had leapt out of the bushes. Becky hoped this shooting would remove suspicion from her and her family and allow Chris to get away with Kay's murder. Even after admitting all of that, Becky still insisted that she had nothing to do with Kay's death. She told Edmunds that she had just totally messed up when she had given her son, Chris, the impression that she really wanted him to go do something horrible to Kay. But police and prosecutors did not believe that Becky was as innocent as she let on, and so both she and her son Chris were arrested. In the end, Becky and Chris pleaded guilty to the murder of Kay Parsons in order to avoid the death penalty. Both are now serving life sentences without the possibility of parole. "38-year-old Linda Jensen could not believe how lucky she was. As she and her husband Charlie looked down at the beautiful face of their brand new baby daughter, Linda could not stop smiling. And when Charlie leaned down and gave Linda's cheek a gentle kiss and told her how much he loved her, Linda felt like her heart might burst with happiness. For both Linda and Charlie, this moment and this new addition to their family was something neither of them could have imagined when they first met almost 27 years earlier. That's when Linda, age 8, had gone on a summer vacation with her family to Spicer, Minnesota, where they stayed in a lakefront cabin that had been owned by one of Charlie's relatives. Charlie, who had been 12 at the time, had spent most of his time at the lake playing with Linda's two brothers. But as summers went by and Linda and Charlie both grew out of their awkward teenage years, the childhood friends had eventually become childhood sweethearts. And after Charlie came back home to Minnesota after serving in the U.S. Army as a combat soldier in Vietnam, everyone in both their families knew that Charlie and Linda would get married. Charlie in his dress military uniform, and Linda looking beautiful and radiant in her white bridal gown. 4 years later, on January 27, 1974, the couple had their first child, a little boy named Andrew. But by the time Andrew was just 4 years old, his parents' marriage had fallen apart. Like a lot of other Vietnam veterans, Charlie had come back from the war with a psychological condition called post-traumatic stress disorder. Symptoms included feelings of irritability and edginess that had been triggered by his combat experience. And over the years, Charlie's drug of choice for treating his PTSD was alcohol. Lots and lots of alcohol. Finally, in 1978, after nearly 7 years of marriage, Linda had filed for divorce. Not because she didn't love Charlie, but because his constant drinking had made their life together impossible. And after that divorce, Linda would spend the next 12 years of her life never quite able to forget Charlie, and also never quite able to find any relationship that didn't end in one kind of a disaster or another. There had been a long-term relationship that had produced another son, a little boy named Joey, but that relationship ended without Linda marrying Joey's father. Not long after that, there had been one more failed marriage, which had taken Linda and Joey first to Colorado and then to California. In both relationships, the breakups had left very bad feelings. Linda's ex-boyfriend and Joey's father had been a partner with anger and substance abuse issues, who refused to pay child support for Joey. Linda's ex-husband, who still lived out in California, had adopted Joey, but he'd never forgiven Linda for not having any children with him. And things had only gotten messier during the divorce proceedings when her ex-husband, John Silliman, was ordered to pay Linda $300 a month in child support for Joey. Finally, with no place left to go, Linda had accepted the offer from her older sister, Sandy, that Linda and Joey should just come back home to Minneapolis and live with Sandy until Linda could pick up the pieces of her broken life. Now, as Linda looked up at Charlie from her bed in the hospital maternity ward, she could not even see the smallest trace of the angry and damaged-seeming young man she had left behind 13 years earlier. Because, for Charlie, the divorce from Linda had been a wake-up call. And once he realized just how much his drinking had cost him in terms of his marriage, family, friendships, money, and work, Charlie had made a promise to himself and to his son, Andrew, that he would get clean and sober. And that's exactly what Charlie did. And by the time Linda had returned to Minnesota, settled herself and her 8-year-old Joey into her sister Sandy's cozy little wood-paneled bungalow and started looking for a job, bumping into Charlie again was like meeting up with the man of her dreams. No longer a drinker, Charlie was now a successful carpenter and contractor who had taught those carpentry skills to their son Andrew. And like Linda, Charlie was unattached, and the same attraction and feeling of friendship that had drawn them together back when they were childhood sweethearts was still very much there. In fact, the hard life experience they both had gained in the years they'd spent apart
seemed to make that attraction even stronger and deeper. And before long, Linda was slipping out of the house she shared with her sister a few evenings a week after Joey was in bed, and coming home later in the evening looking like she just won the lottery. Sandy and Linda had always been very close, and Sandy had been the one person Linda had confided in over the course of the last 12 stormy years. And Sandy knew her sister well enough to know that there was only one man who had ever made Linda look that happy, and that man was Charlie Jensen. So it came as no surprise to Sandy when Linda and Charlie had announced that they would be getting married again. And the date they chose for their wedding, April 3rd, 1991, was exactly 20 years to the day that they had gotten married the first time, 20 years earlier. What had been a surprise had been the fact that shortly after moving in with Charlie, Linda had gotten pregnant. And by the time the couple had said "I do" to one another for the second time in their lives, Linda was already 7 months along. And now, 2 months later, on June 12, 1991, Charlie, who was 42 at the time, and Linda, who was 4 days shy of her 39th birthday, were once again brand new parents. And for Linda, the arrival of baby Lisa marked the beginning of the life she had spent the last 12 years looking for. By late February 1992, when baby Lisa was 8 months old, Linda, Charlie, Joey, and Lisa had all settled into a comfortable routine. The roomy 3-bedroom house that Charlie had just finished building 2 summers ago had a deep wooden porch out front that overlooked the yard and driveway and the trees that shaded the house from the sun. It was one of Linda's favorite places, and it also became a gathering spot for Andrew, who now had a son of his own, and for Linda's sister, Sandy, who visited as much as she could to see Linda and the kids. Linda had taken time off from her job working at a local school with disabled children. Charlie had plenty of construction jobs, but he still managed to spend as much time as he could with Linda and their grandson, as well as with Lisa, Joey, and Andrew. And by late summer, Linda had gotten back to her regular exercise routine. In addition to dropping in at the local health club, Linda had also started running again, and it wasn't long before she was a very familiar sight in the nearby neighborhoods that were part of her daily 5-mile loop. And it wasn't just Linda, Charlie, and baby Lisa who were all thriving. Linda's son, Joey, who had been disabled by a severe stroke when he was just 6 weeks old, had also settled happily into his new life in Minnesota. He enjoyed being part of a close and loving family, and he enjoyed his role as big brother, and now that he was about to turn 10 years old, Joey was also looking forward to joining the local Boy Scout troop. It wasn't until the last weekend in February, on Saturday, February 22nd, that Linda had given her sister, Sandy, the most recent update on the one dark cloud that had drifted into the Jensens' otherwise very sunny life. The sisters were sitting on the sofa in the living room catching up on family news. Linda had talked to the local Boy Scout troop leader about signing Joey up for Boy Scouts. Charlie was working on a construction site all the way out in Maplewood, 50 miles away, and that after a long Minnesota winter, March and spring were finally not too far away. But when the ring of the telephone interrupted their conversation, Sandy immediately noticed the look of strain that flashed across Linda's face. Sandy knew that sometime within the last 2 weeks, Linda had gotten 2 calls from Joey's biological father, Robert Beard. Despite having given up custody of Joey and not paying child support, Robert was now insisting on having longer and more frequent visitation with his 9-year-old son. Linda had left Robert after he had become physically abusive, so Robert's calls and escalating demands had felt very threatening as well as upsetting. But a moment later, Linda's face had relaxed, and she had insisted to Sandy that she, Linda, and Charlie had the situation under control. And by the time Sandy was ready to go, the conversation had veered into memories of the past, and Linda's announcement that Charlie had always been the only man Linda had ever loved. By the time Sandy was hugging Linda goodbye, Linda was joking that the only real problem in her life now were the painful shin splints she had gotten from all of her recent running. And 2 days later, on the morning of Monday, February 24th, that was absolutely true. When Linda woke up that morning and took her first few steps across the cold bedroom floor, she winced as the sudden pain flared up along her shin bones. But glancing at her watch, Linda actually welcomed how fast the pain had cleared her mind because, once again, she had managed to oversleep. After pulling on her sweatsuit over her t-shirt and underwear and checking that baby Lisa was still asleep, Linda hurried into Joey's room to wake him up. Linda had meant to get out of bed when Charlie had kissed her goodbye and left for work at 6:45 a.m., but the last thing she remembered was hearing Charlie tell her that he'd changed baby Lisa's diaper and that he'd see Linda that evening after he got back from Maplewood. Peeking out the window now, Linda saw that it had snowed the night before, which meant that Andrew's outdoor carpentry job would be canceled and Linda would not be watching her grandson that day. Linda was glad that Charlie's job out in Maplewood was indoors, but she also couldn't help thinking how nice it would have been if today had been a snow day for them too. By 7:45 a.m., baby Lisa was awake and had her morning feeding, and Joey, his breakfast toast still clutched in his hand, was climbing onto the school bus and waving back to Linda and his 8-month-old sister. After watching the bus drive off down County Road 15, Linda turned back to the house and walked on sore legs to the front door. She had told Charlie before he left for work, and before she fell asleep instead of getting up, that her shins hurt too much to go running that day, so her plan for the day was just to hang out with the children and enjoy the view through the sliding glass door that led out onto the front deck. Now standing at baby Lisa's changing table, Linda unwrapped Lisa from her cocoon of blankets, but decided to leave the baby in her pajamas in the playpen while Linda cleaned up the breakfast dishes. But just as Linda was ready to go back out to the living room and get Lisa dressed for the day, Linda was surprised by the sound of a knock on the front door. The Jensen house was set far enough away from the road with a long enough driveway that the family did not get that many unexpected visitors. But this was Big Lake, Minnesota, population just over 3,000 people, and most people here never even bothered to lock their doors, let alone think twice about opening that door to a neighbor who might need help or a favor. So, after leaving baby Lisa right where she was, in the playpen in the living room, Linda dried her hands on a kitchen towel, and with a smile, she walked to the front door. At least she'd have something interesting to talk to Charlie about when he called, as he always did, sometime during the morning from any job site where he was working. It was 9:30 a.m. when Charlie made his first call home to Linda. She usually picked up right away, eager to find out how he was doing and tell him about something wonderful that Lisa had just accomplished. Now, frowning a little, he drummed his fingers on the telephone receiver while he waited for Linda to pick up. Instead, the answering machine came on, and so Charlie left a message for his wife, telling her he'd try again later. But after the third unanswered call of the day, Charlie decided to leave work early. Linda sometimes screened telephone calls by letting them go to the answering machine, but if that was the case today, she would have picked up as soon as she heard his voice leaving a message. As he hopped into his truck and drove northwest from Maplewood towards Big Lake, Charlie told himself not to worry. Maybe Linda had decided to take a nap at the same time she had put Lisa down for a nap. Maybe she'd stepped outside onto the front deck to look at the snowfall. And besides, school had let out, so by now, Joey should be home with his mom and baby sister. By the time Charlie walked into his house, it was 4:05 p.m., and the first thing he noticed was the sound of 8-month-old Lisa crying. Charlie immediately yelled out for Linda, but Linda didn't yell back. Dropping his coat onto the nearest chair, Charlie followed the sound of Lisa's crying through the dining room, where he saw Joey doing his homework at a small table near the wall, and into the living room, where he saw baby Lisa in her playpen, still in her pajamas, her face red and wet with tears. Even as Charlie picked Lisa out of the playpen and stepped over to the foot of the stairs to call his wife's name again, he knew something was wrong. Linda would never have let Lisa stay in last night's pajamas for the entire day. And again, when Charlie did not get a response from Linda, he put Lisa back down inside of the playpen and automatically began a search of the house for his wife. Joey had seemed uncertain when Charlie asked whether Joey had seen his mom, so telling Joey not to worry, Charlie started his search in the laundry room in the basement where Linda would have been out of Joey's sight. But by the time Charlie left the empty basement to check the upstairs bedrooms, he wasn't even trying to act calm. Taking the stairs 2 at a time, the question went round and round in his mind. What on earth could have happened to his wife? But not even Charlie's worst nightmares could have prepared him for what was inside of the bedroom that he and Linda shared. When he pushed open the bedroom door, the first thing he saw was a bundled up white quilt on the floor at the foot of the bed. Only it wasn't just a quilt. Peeking out from the folds of the material, Charlie could see Linda's shiny dark curls and her long, bare, slender legs. And in the middle of the quilt, at the center of a dark red stain, Charlie saw the wooden handle of one of the kitchen knives he and Linda kept in a butcher's block on their kitchen counter. Falling to his knees on the floor next to Linda's body, Charlie reached out and pushed a fold of the quilt down so he could see Linda's face. And that's when Charlie knew that the woman he had loved ever since they were both children was dead. A few minutes later, and the circular drive in front of the Jensens' two-story house had started filling with emergency medical vehicles and deputies from the Sherburne County Sheriff's Department. Charlie's 911 call had summarized everything the newly widowed husband would be able to tell police about his wife's murder. Quote, "My wife is dead. I just got home and my little boy is here, and I checked in the bedroom and she's been stabbed. I've got 2 kids here. My God, what's happened?" As medics entered the house and confirmed that Linda was dead, deputies from the sheriff's department got busy putting yellow crime scene tape up around the perimeter of the Jensens' house. They also began spreading out into the rural neighborhood to see if anyone in the area might have seen or heard anything unusual that day. Knowing they had a homicide on their hands, the Sherburne Sheriff's Department immediately contacted the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, located 47 miles southeast in the city of St. Paul. Soon, along with state investigators, the Sherburne Sheriff's Department would also get help from law enforcement in Benton and Stearns counties, along with help from the nearby cities of St. Cloud and Elk River. But even before those outside agencies had arrived in Big Lake to help conduct interviews and process the crime scene, investigators with the sheriff's department had already come to some of their own conclusions about the murder. After doing an informal interview with Charlie, who had described his entire day and all his interactions with his wife, from the time he woke up and left for work, to the series of unanswered phone calls, right up until the moment he dialed 911, police were working on the assumption that Linda had probably been murdered sometime that morning. That guess would later be confirmed by the autopsy report on Linda's body, which would further narrow the time of the crime to sometime between 8 and 10 a.m. Based on the brutality of the crime and the fact that there was no sign of forced entry and nothing of value appeared to be missing, police also assumed that this crime was personal, not the result of a robbery gone wrong. And finally, given that Linda was naked when she was wrapped into the white quilt and then stabbed, police also believed that what they were looking at was not just a murder, but a violent sexual assault. And this assumption would also be confirmed when the medical examiner found traces of semen on Linda's ankle and inside of her body, along with defensive wounds that suggested that she had struggled with all her might against her attacker. The medical examiner would also discover that the actual cause of Linda's death was strangulation, and that she had likely been dead even before the killer had plunged the 10-inch long blade of the butcher's knife so deeply into her chest that the fabric of the quilt had become embedded in the wound. According to one investigator, it looked to the police like someone had actually tried to carve Linda's heart out of her chest. And Linda's sister, Sandy, would later remember the medical examiner telling her that along with the surface bruises, scratches, and deeper bruising to her sister's body, there was a single dried tear on Linda's cheek. But, unfortunately for investigators, even though they had lots of details about how Linda had died, they did not have many clues about who might have committed the crime. It would also turn out that aside from the semen samples that the medical examiner would find in and on Linda's body, there just wasn't much physical and forensic evidence that crime scene techs were able to recover from inside of the Jensen house. Whoever had raped and killed Linda had stripped the sheets, which may have contained hair, blood, and skin tissues, and taken them away with them. According to Charlie, the only other items that appeared to be missing might also have contained DNA evidence. the t-shirt and underwear that Linda had been wearing that morning and that she was probably still wearing when she was attacked. The first obvious suspect in Linda's murder was her husband, Charlie Jensen. It hadn't taken police long to learn that the couple had been married back in 1971, but had divorced because of Charlie's post-traumatic stress disorder, which made him prone to anger and irritability, coupled with his alcohol abuse. But over the next 72 hours, the police would confirm Charlie's work alibi. Charlie would also pass a lie detector test and volunteer a DNA sample that would eventually rule him out as Linda's killer. But even as Charlie was being cleared from the suspect list, police were already following what they believed was a very promising lead provided by the mail carrier who delivered mail along the rural route where Charlie and Linda lived. According to the mail carrier, when she had arrived at the Jensen house at 11:30 a.m. on Monday, February 24th, the day of the murder, she saw a white male in a copper-colored pickup truck pulling out of the Jensen's driveway. The mail carrier's description was detailed enough that police artists were able to put together a sketch that showed a man in his 30s or maybe 40s with scraggly brown hair and a gray flecked beard who had what looked, to the mail carrier, like red scratches on his hands. Less than an hour after the sketch was released to the media and featured in print and TV news, the tips from the public started to pour in. And soon police were interviewing anyone in Big Lake Township who had reported seeing the copper-colored 1970s Ford pickup truck or its alleged driver. On March 2nd, 6 days after Linda's murder and 2 days after her funeral service, a heartbroken Charlie Jensen packed up the home he had built for himself and Linda and moved his little family into an apartment building. As Charlie would tell his adult son Andrew and Linda's sister Sandy, it was just too hard for Charlie to walk into that bedroom where Linda had been killed. 11 days later, and 17 days after Linda's death, police saw their only solid lead in the Linda Jensen homicide go up in smoke. The mail carrier, who had helped police draw a sketch of a possible suspect she saw driving away from the Jensen's property on the morning of the murder, began to change her story. She now thought that instead of being copper-colored, the truck she saw might have been light green with white panels and snowplow brackets on the front. And instead of having a scraggly beard, the driver may have been wearing a coat with a fur-lined collar. Meanwhile, police investigating other men in Linda's life were also running into dead ends. After learning that Joey's biological father, Robert Beard, had been arguing with Linda in the 2 weeks before her death about visitation with Joey, they didn't waste any time bringing Robert in for questioning. Police also knew from conversations with Linda's family that Linda had said that Robert had been physically abusive and had a bad temper as well as substance abuse issues. And at first, Robert Beard looked like he could become the new #1 murder suspect. In conversations with police, he was angry and defensive. He lied to investigators, denying that he had recently spoken with Linda on the phone. His alibi, that he was home alone at the time of the murder, was weak. But Robert also pointed out that since he did not have a car or driver's license, there was no way he could have gotten undetected to Linda's house and killed her. Once Robert lawyered up and refused to give police a DNA sample, the only thing police could do was keep him on the suspect list and move on to the next man in Linda's life, her ex-husband, John Silliman, who lived in California. Although John's alibi, that he was working at a local elementary school on the day of Linda's murder, turned out to be airtight, there was something about John that just made police suspicious. He'd clearly had a volatile relationship with Linda, and he told police that Linda had pressured him into adopting Joey instead of having children of their own. It wasn't until police went through John's financial records with a fine-tooth comb to rule out any murder-for-hire scheme that police crossed John off their list of suspects. By the end of May 1992, 9 weeks after Linda had been found brutally raped and murdered in her own bedroom, the investigation into her death had ground to a halt. Police from 3 different jurisdictions had followed up on more than 1,000 tips. They had interviewed hundreds of friends, coworkers, family members, neighbors, and possible suspects. They had searched but failed to find any trace of the sheets and clothing that had been taken from the Jensen house on the morning of Monday, February 24th. They had also collected and stored more than 80 DNA samples from men who had any connection to Linda, from a trainer at her gym who had once given her a bouquet of flowers, to her ex-lover and husbands. None of them would match the semen sample collected from Linda's body. But while investigators may have quietly and reluctantly shelved the murder book on Linda Jensen, there were 3 people in Linda's life who absolutely refused to let the case go completely cold. At least twice a week for the next 7 years, Linda's older sister, Sandy, called the Sherburne County Sheriff's Department asking if there had been any developments in the case. Charlie also remained in touch with police, and he and Sandy made an appearance together on a popular TV show that featured true crime, hoping that the publicity might result in someone coming forward with new evidence. The third person who would not let the case go was one of its lead investigators. Bruce Anderson had made a promise to the Jensen family that he would not retire from the Sherburne County Sheriff's Department until law enforcement had found the person who had killed Linda Jensen. Like Sandy, Deputy Anderson was convinced that someone out in Big Lake Township held the key to solving this homicide, that someone had information that they might be holding back or that they didn't realize was important. Even after all the leads seemed to dry up, Sandy, Charlie, and Deputy Anderson had one strategy left. They all urged law enforcement and the media to ask again if anyone could remember anything that might turn out to be related to the murder. But it wasn't until the early summer of 2000, more than 8 years after Linda Jensen's murder, that police finally got the tip they needed to break Linda's unsolved homicide case wide open. By then, Bruce Anderson had been elected sheriff of the Sherburne County Sheriff's Department, a position that gave him the authority to call for the creation of a special cold case task force of state and local law enforcement whose job would be to reopen the investigation into Linda's murder. The new round of publicity, along with a $20,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Linda's killer, was enough to get people, once again, talking and thinking about the unsolved homicide that had terrified the residents of Big Lake back in 1992. And on a mild day in June of 2000, the Sherburne County Sheriff's Department got a visit from a woman named Angela Hennon. The renewed interest in Linda Jensen's murder and Sandy's pleas through the newspapers for everyone to search their memory for anything that might shed light on her sister's murder had finally struck a chord. And after 8 years, Angela was finally ready to give police the man that she had long suspected of hiding a very dark secret. What police found out when they followed up on Angela's tip would send shockwaves throughout the state of Minnesota. And based on that information, here is a reconstruction of what investigators believe really happened to Linda Jensen on the morning of Monday, February 24th, 1992. The knock on the front door of Charlie and Linda's house was so not expected that Linda almost dropped the plate she was holding into the open dishwasher. But even though she was surprised to have a visitor this early in the morning, it never occurred to Linda not to answer the door, especially since another loud knock might wake up 8-month-old baby Lisa, who had fallen asleep in the playpen in the living room. So, after wiping her hands dry on a kitchen towel and zipping the top of her tracksuit all the way up to her chin, Linda pushed her hair back from her face and walked out to see who was coming to call. Even as she started to peer out one of the front windows, Linda recognized the voice calling to her from outside. A moment later, and Linda's visitor was stamping the snow off his boots before stepping through the open door. But even as Linda closed the door behind her visitor and apologized for how untidy her house was, Linda's killer was hardly listening. Instead, he was drinking in every detail of Linda's appearance. He had been watching Linda for such a long time, but until now, he had never really been alone with her, never really had a chance to let her know how he felt about her. He wanted to ask her if she was planning to go for a run that day, and he wanted to tell her how much he always looked forward to seeing her jog past the house where he lived with his wife and 4 kids. But before he could even find a way to put his proposal to Linda, he could see that she had stopped smiling and had even taken a few steps backward. And now she was asking him what he was doing there, because now really wasn't a great time after all for her to have any company. And if this was about Joey, she'd rather talk some other time when Charlie was there too. But before Linda could get any further away from him, the killer reached out his hand and grabbed her arm. And as soon as he did that, he knew it didn't matter how Linda felt about him or what Linda wanted. What mattered was what he wanted. And after a short but violent struggle, the killer had Linda right where he wanted her. Upstairs in the master bedroom, all her clothes stripped off, her dark curly hair spread out on the bed under him, looking just as she looked in all of his fantasies, right down to having his hands wrapped around her slender throat, squeezing as hard as he could until finally she stopped struggling and lay still. Once Linda's killer was finished, he bundled her body inside of a clean white quilt and pushed her down onto the floor at the foot of the bed. Still breathing heavily, the killer straightened his own clothing, then left the bedroom and went down to the kitchen. On the counter, next to a jar of red and white candy canes, he saw the butcher's block with its collection of kitchen knives. Grabbing the wooden handle of the largest knife, Linda's killer hurried back upstairs to the bedroom. Looking down at Linda, lying on her back with the quilt wrapped around her, all he could see of her body was the top of her head, and her slim legs from the knees down, her heels resting lightly on the floorboards. Straddling Linda's midsection, the killer raised the knife and began stabbing at Linda's heart, over and over again, until finally plunging the knife through the center of her rib cage with so much force that it pinned the quilt into Linda's chest. After hauling himself back up onto his feet, the killer turned to the bed and stripped off the sheets and gathered up Linda's torn t-shirt and underwear. Rolling everything into a ball, the killer took one last look around and then left the bedroom, hurried down the steps, picked up his coat from where he had dropped it near the door, and just a few minutes later, Charlie and Linda's neighbor and the leader of the local Boy Scout troop, 28-year-old Kent Jones, was already halfway back to his own house less than half a mile away. In the weeks after Linda's murder, local police would interview Kent Jones after hearing a report that he had seen the copper-colored truck police were looking for driving around Big Lake Township. But during that routine interview, not only did Kent deny knowing Linda Jensen, Kent's wife gave her husband an alibi for the day of Linda's murder. It wasn't until 8 years later that Angela Hennon, who had had an affair with Kent sometime after Linda's death, would tell police that whenever she had brought up the subject of Linda's death, a crime that everyone at the time was talking about, Kent reacted violently. When Angela had asked if Kent had ever met Linda, at first he insisted really aggressively that he had not. But later, Kent brought up the subject himself and told Angela that in fact, he had known Linda. Kent's violent reaction and the way he talked about Linda Jensen had always made Angela wonder, in the very back of her mind, if Kent might have somehow been involved in Linda's death. It would turn out that Angela's suspicions were 100% correct. Not only did Kent Jones know Linda from her inquiries to him about getting Joey signed up for Boy Scouts, he had become obsessed with the beautiful dark-haired woman he'd seen out running several times a week. And he had begun to watch her closely and learn her routines and fantasize about her constantly. When police re-interviewed Kent in June of 2000, Kent's wife contradicted Kent's claim that he had never met Linda. In front of investigators, Deborah Jones reminded Kent that Linda had actually come by their house to pick up a Boy Scout application for her 9-year-old son. Police also discovered that Kent had a criminal record. He had been convicted of insurance fraud, and in 1995, 3 years after Linda's murder, Kent had been convicted of domestic violence. That charge stemmed from an incident in which Kent's wife was hospitalized for 4 days after suffering a stab wound to her stomach and 2 puncture wounds on her forearm. Deborah would later tell police that the stab wound was the result of an accident, that she had slipped and fallen onto the knife, which was resting blade up in the family's open dishwasher. Although Kent refused to voluntarily give up a sample of his DNA, investigators quickly came back with a search warrant that forced him to provide a DNA sample. Less than 1 month later, the DNA analysis came back with a match. Kent Jones's DNA matched the DNA found in the semen that the medical examiner had collected from Linda's body. On July 25, 2000, 8 years and 5 months after Linda Jensen's brutal murder, police arrested Kent Jones for first-degree murder and sexual assault. 17 months after his arrest on December 8, 2001, and then again at a new trial 5 years later, Kent Jones was found guilty of those charges and sentenced to life in prison. In 2009, 17 years after Linda's murder, Angela Hennon would collect $18,000 in reward money for giving police the tip that led to the arrest and conviction of Kent Jones. For Charlie Jensen, Linda's death at the hands of Kent Jones has left some scars that will just never go away. Quote, "He took a mother away from her children, a wife from her husband, and a beautiful person away from the world." End quote. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please remove the rubber lip from the Amazon Music follow button's dustpan so they can never quite get everything up when they are sweeping. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today.